The morning Harriet Wells stood in the doorway of the little clapboard house and watched John Yates ride away. She told herself she would not cry, and she had broken that promise before he even cleared the first gate post. It was the spring of 1878, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the sky stretched so wide and so merciless that a person could feel swallowed whole by it on the best of days, and utterly crushed by it on the worst. The land out here was not gentle. It was not the kind of country that forgave weakness or carelessness, and it had no patience for sentiment. The grasses rolled in long amber waves toward horizons that seemed to retreat the more you chased them, and the wind never truly stopped. It only changed direction. Harriet had come to love this country despite all of that, or maybe because of it. She had come to love it because John loved it, and that was a truth she had never said aloud to anyone, not even to herself, until right now, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes burning. She was 24 years old. She had brown hair that she kept braided and pinned against the back of her neck, because loose hair on the Panhandle meant a mouthful of it every time the wind kicked up, which was always. Her eyes were the particular shade of gray that shifts to green depending on the light, and her hands were the hands of a woman who had been working this land for going on 3 years. Rough at the knuckles, capable at the wrists. She had arrived in Clarendon, Texas, in 1875, having answered a newspaper notice seeking a schoolteacher willing to relocate westward. She had been 21, newly finished with her schooling in Missouri, and she had been hungry for something she could not name at the time. Adventure, maybe. Purpose. Something that felt real in a way that the comfortable life her parents had mapped out for her back in St. Louis simply did not. She had not expected to fall in love with the land, and she certainly had not planned to fall in love with John Yates. He was 27 now, lean and sun-darkened, with black hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. He was not a man who talked a great deal, which in the beginning had made Harriet think him cold, even arrogant. He ran a cattle operation out of the southern edge of Donley County, working a spread of about 400 acres that he had built up from almost nothing after arriving in the Panhandle as a 19-year-old with $40 and a horse he had raised himself. He had hired 2 hands, a Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo Vasquez, who had been working Texas cattle since before John was born, and a young man from Tennessee named Calvin Briggs, who was 22 and still learning which end of a rope was which, though he was getting better. John also had a neighbor, an older cattleman named Harold Prout, who ran the largest spread in the county and who had taken a certain paternal interest in John's operation, since John had helped Prout's men pull 150 head out of a Box Canyon flood 3 years prior. The cattle drive that was taking John away was Harold Prout's drive, and John was going as segundo second in command, because Prout's regular trail boss had broken his leg falling off a wagon in February and was still in no condition to ride. The drive was headed north to Dodge City, Kansas, with over 1,200 head of longhorn cattle, a journey of some 400 miles that would take approximately 6 to 8 weeks. It was good money, and John's own operation was small enough that he could leave it with Rodrigo minding things and not lose too much ground. The opportunity was too good to turn down. Both John and Harriet knew that. And yet, Harriet had known the drive was coming for 2 months. She had thought herself prepared for it. She had thought she had made peace with it, the way a practical woman makes peace with necessary things. She had cooked an enormous meal the night before, salt pork and fried potatoes and cornbread and a dried apple pie because John loved pie and because she wanted to do something kind for him before he left. They had sat across the kitchen table from each other and talked about ordinary things. The schoolhouse needing its roof patched before autumn, Rodrigo's concern about the water level in the creek, whether Calvin had finally learned to properly set a picket line. They had talked the way 2 people talk when they are trying very hard not to say the thing they most want to say. She had not slept much. She had lain in her narrow bed. They were not yet married, lived in separate houses, though she rented the small dwelling at the edge of his property, and he lived in the main house 200 yards distant, and she had stared at the ceiling and listened to the coyotes calling to each other out in the dark grass. She had thought about all the things that could happen over 6 weeks and 400 miles. Cowboys were lost on cattle drives. Men were thrown from horses or caught in stampedes or swept away crossing flooded rivers. The trail to Dodge City was long and it was hard and it was not guaranteed. She had told herself she was being foolish. John Yates had been working cattle his entire adult life. He was careful and competent and had a level head in a crisis. He would be fine. But when morning came and she stood in the doorway of her little house and watched him ride out, sitting easy on his big sorrel gelding named Absalom, his bedroll and saddlebags packed, his hat pulled low against the early sun, when she watched him raise one hand in farewell without turning back because men like John Yates did not make leave-taking harder than it already was, that was when the tears came, quiet and unwilling. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth and breath through her nose and told herself it was the wind making her eyes water. She stood there watching until he was nothing but a dark shape against the golden horizon, and then she went inside and sat at her kitchen table and cried properly for about 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face on her apron, stood up, and went about her morning. John Yates had ridden about 1.5 miles before he reached the first ridge. It was a long, shallow rise in the land, not dramatic, nothing like the draws and bluffs you found further south, but enough to give a rider a clear view back over the terrain he had just crossed. He had ridden it 100 times. He knew every feature of this land the way he knew the lines of his own hands. He had planned to crest it without slowing, to set his face north and not look back, because looking back was something he did not let himself do as a rule. Looking back meant softness, and softness on a cattle drive got people killed. He crested the ridge. He could see the little clapboard house from up here, small and pale in the morning light, the kitchen garden just beginning to show green, the single cottonwood in the yard still pale with new leaves. He could see the doorway. He could see that she was gone inside. He sat on Absalom for a long moment and thought about Harriet Wells standing in that doorway. He had seen her from the corner of his eye as he rode out. He had made himself not turn. He had told himself it was kinder not to turn, that goodbyes dragged out only made the leaving worse. But he had seen the way she was standing. Arms crossed, shoulders pulled in, chin lifted in that particular way she had when she was trying very hard not to feel something too publicly. And something in his chest had pulled so tight it nearly took his breath. He and Harriet had been, what were they? He wasn't sure he had a clean word for it. She had come to this country as the school teacher and had rented the property's small house because it was the closest available dwelling to the schoolhouse, which sat at the edge of town about 2 miles west. He had not wanted to rent it to a woman alone, not because he thought poorly of women, but because he worried about her safety and about the kind of talk that might arise. She had informed him, with a precision and a quiet firmness that he would come to recognize as entirely characteristic, that she did not require his opinion on her safety, and that she was prepared to pay a fair price for the property, and would he like to discuss terms or not. He had rented her the house. For the first 6 months they had been politely distant. She taught school, he ran cattle, they nodded to each other across the distance of 200 yards and occasionally discussed practical matters like the well pump and the fence line. He had thought her fine-looking but prickly. She had thought him reliable but closed off. Neither of them had been paying much attention to what was building. It had been a storm that changed things. October of 1876, a blue norther that rolled down from the Colorado Territory without much warning, dropping the temperature 30 degrees in 2 hours and bringing ice that coated everything, the fence wire, the grass, the horses' manes in a hard crystalline shell. Harriet had been caught out in it returning from town, her horse shying badly in the wind, and John had found her on the road trying to calm the animal and shaking badly with cold. He had taken her back to the main house, built up the fire, made coffee that was considerably stronger than she was used to, and they had sat across from each other at his kitchen table for 3 hours waiting for the worst of it to pass, and they had talked. She told him about Missouri, about her father's hardware store and her mother's very definite opinions about what constituted a proper life for a woman of good family. She told him about reading every book the public library had on the West, about the particular restlessness she'd felt that had no name until she got on a westbound train and found out that restlessness had been pointing at the horizon all along. He listened in the way he had of listening, completely still, with full attention, that she had at first mistaken for indifference and now understood was the opposite. He told her about growing up in Georgia, about a childhood that had been marked by the long shadow the war cast over everything. He had been 11 when the fighting ended, and what it left behind was a ruined economy and a different kind of poverty than physical destitution, a poverty of spirit that settled over his father's farm like a permanent weather system. He had left at 19, not because he had anything against his family, but because staying felt like slow suffocation, and the West was where a man who had nothing could make something. He told her this simply, without drama, as though it were just a sequence of logical facts rather than the defining architecture of his entire life. She had looked at him across that kitchen table in the firelight with the ice storm howling outside and thought, "I see you." She had not said it, but she had thought it, and something had shifted between them that night that could not be shifted back. Through the winter of 1876 and into 1877, they had moved slowly and carefully toward each other in the way that people do when they are afraid of getting something wrong, when what they are reaching for feels too important to risk rushing. He started appearing at her door on Sunday afternoons with minor practical pretexts, needed to check the chimney, wondered if the well pump was still giving trouble, thought she might want to know the trading post had gotten in a new bolt of fabric. She started cooking extra when she made Sunday dinner and leaving a plate on his porch. They rode together into town on Saturdays. He taught her better rope technique. She taught him that cornbread benefited from a little more molasses than he'd been using. By the summer of 1877, there had been one evening when they were sitting on the top fence rail, watching the cattle come in for the evening, the sky going all copper and rose behind them, and she had said something amusing about one of the school children and he had laughed, a real, full laugh, rare enough from him that it startled them both. And when the laugh faded, they were looking at each other, and the distance between them on that fence rail had somehow become almost nothing. He had put his hand over hers where it rested on the rail. She had turned her hand over and held his. They had sat like that watching the sun go down and had not felt any need to speak. He had kissed her for the first time in late August of 1877, on the porch of her little house after walking her home from a church social. It had been careful and thorough, and she had the clear thought afterward that she had never been kissed before in any way that counted. Since then, they had been understanding themselves to be heading somewhere together without having stated it outright. John was not a man who did things hastily or carelessly, and Harriet, despite appearances, was not a woman who did things for lack of thought either. They were building something. They both knew it. They just had not yet put the formal name to it. And now he was leaving for 8 weeks, and she had cried, and he was sitting on Absalom at the top of the first ridge, looking back at the small pale house with its new garden and its single cottonwood tree, and he was making a decision that surprised even himself. He turned the horse around. He was back at her door in under 10 minutes. He tied Absalom to the fence post and went to the door and knocked, which he would not ordinarily do. He would usually just call out her name, but something about this moment felt like it required a certain formality. She opened the door. Her eyes were red. She had clearly been crying, and she was clearly mortified about this, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. "You forgot something," she said, and her voice was admirably steady for a woman who had been weeping 3 minutes ago. "Yes," he said. "I did." She waited. "Harriet," He took his hat off. He stood there holding it in both hands, this man who almost never showed uncertainty, and she could see something working in his face that she had not seen before. I can't leave without saying something I should have said a good while ago, maybe a long while ago. John, let me say it. He looked at her directly. I want to marry you. I want to marry you, and I want you to still be here when I get back. Not because you rented the house, but because this is your home. And I am asking you, right now, before I ride out, because I realized halfway up that ridge that leaving without asking was possibly the stupidest thing I have ever come close to doing, and I have done some genuinely stupid things. Harriet Wells looked at him for a long moment. The morning wind moved between them, lifting a strand of hair that had escaped her braid. Somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called twice. "You're going to be late," she said. "I know," he said. "Harold Prout is not a patient man." "No," he agreed. "John Yates," she said, and her voice had gone soft in a way that reached right into him. "I thought you were never going to ask." He put his hat back on. He took her face in both his rough-palmed hands and kissed her once completely, and she gripped the front of his shirt and kissed him back with everything she had. When they separated, both slightly breathless, she pressed her forehead briefly against his jaw. "Come back safe," she said. "Come back to me." "I'll come back," he said. "You have my word." He rode out again, and this time when he crested the first ridge and looked back, she was standing in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her chin up, and she raised one hand, and he raised his, and then he put his eyes north and rode. The 6 weeks that followed were some of the longest of Harriet's life. She threw herself into the schoolhouse with a ferocity that her students, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, found somewhat alarming and impressive in equal measure. She organized a readers' circle for the older children, debated the arithmetic curriculum with herself at 3 in the morning, and sent 2 formal letters to the county education board, requesting additional textbooks that she knew perfectly well would not arrive before next year, but that needed to be requested nonetheless. She was a woman in motion, because a woman in motion did not have as much time to stand at her window watching the northern horizon. Rodrigo Vasquez, who was 43 and had a wife in Clarendon named Inez and 4 children, looked after John's cattle with the kind of unhurried thoroughness that came from a lifetime of this work. He was a quiet man with a broad, deeply weathered face and dark eyes that missed nothing, and he had an instinctive, practical respect for Harriet that he expressed by occasionally appearing at her fence with a sack of dried beans or a report on the state of the water situation, delivered without ceremony and without condescension, as between 2 people who were equally capable of handling their own affairs. Harriet appreciated this more than she could say. Calvin Briggs, the young Tennessean, was considerably less quiet. He was 22 and enthusiastic, and had a habit of talking at length about subjects he knew only partially, which was most subjects. He also had a good heart and worked hard, and was terrified of Rodrigo's silent competence in the way that young men who do not yet know what they are made of are often terrified by people who do. Harriet liked him, found his chatter useful on quiet afternoons when the loneliness of the Panhandle pressed in, and had taken to feeding him on Wednesdays when he came to check on the well pump. Clarendon itself in 1878 was a small settlement, a few hundred souls, a trading post, a church, a saloon that the more devout members of the community were in a constant state of agitation about, a land office, a blacksmith, a small dry goods concern run by a widow named Agnes Fletcher who knew everything that had ever happened in the county and some things that hadn't happened yet. Agnes Fletcher was 61, had buried 2 husbands, and took an active interest in Harriet's situation with John. "You let that man ride out without a firm understanding?" Agnes asked, on a Tuesday morning when Harriet had come in for flour and thread. "We have an understanding," Harriet said. "A firm one." "He asked me to marry him." Agnes Fletcher went very still, the way people do when they get news they have been expecting but are still delighted by. Then she reached across the counter and patted Harriet's hand with a firm, bony grip. "Well, thank God," she said. "I was beginning to think the man had no sense." "He has a great deal of sense," Harriet said, slightly defensive on John's behalf in the automatic way she had developed. "He does," Agnes agreed, "but sense and timing are different things." "Sit down, I'll make tea." The weeks turned. Harriet received one letter from John, sent back with a returning writer, written in his careful, economical hand on the inside of an envelope, because paper was scarce on the trail. It said that they had crossed the Red River without major incident, though 3 steers had gotten into trouble in the current, that the weather had been fair, that Rodrigo's instinct about the creek level had been correct, and he should be watched for any concerning drop in the summer, that Calvin was doing better with his roping, and that he thought about her at night when the fire died down and the stars came out. That last line, added at the bottom in slightly smaller letters as though he had written everything else, and then sat with the pen, and finally let himself put down the thing he had been working up to. That was the line she read 8 or 9 times, and then carefully folded into the small cedar box on her windowsill, where she kept the few things that mattered most. She wrote back immediately, a letter considerably longer than his, which she suspected he would read with the particular quiet attention he brought to things that came from her. She wrote about the schoolhouse and the children and Agnes Fletcher's reliable opinions. She wrote about the blue sky that had been unbroken for 16 days and how it made the land look like it went on forever. She wrote about how she had started taking her coffee out to the front step in the mornings, and that Absalom was not in the paddock to watch, which was a strange absence, and she found herself talking to the cottonwood tree sometimes instead, which was absurd, and she was telling him anyway. She wrote at the very end, "I am not a woman given to waiting, as you well know, but I find I am very good at waiting for you. Come home." The cattle drive continued north. John Yates discovered, somewhere north of the Cimarron River in Indian Territory, that being segundo on Harold Pruitt's drive was simultaneously one of the more demanding jobs he had taken on, and one of the more satisfying. Pruitt was a good man and an experienced cattleman, broad and red-faced, and given to strong opinions delivered at strong volume. But he was also fair and knowledgeable, and had the drover's instinct for the kind of trouble that was coming before it fully arrived. He rode flank while John worked the point, and the 2 men had developed a shorthand over the course of the previous 3 weeks that required very little actual conversation, which suited John well enough. The drive had 1,214 head when they crossed the Red River, 1,192 when they left the Cimarron crossing. Cattle drives were not without their losses. A stampede triggered by lightning just east of the Cimarron had been the worst night, John riding hard in the driving rain to help turn the leaders, Pruitt's voice carrying through the dark and the thunder, the hands working with that particular focused desperation that cattle drives at their worst required. No men lost, which was the thing that mattered most. 2 cattle drowned in the crossing, others that strayed too wide and were not recoverable. John found himself, in the long evenings when the cattle were settled and the night riders had taken their shift and the fire was low, thinking about Harriet with a clarity and a constancy that might have surprised him a year ago. He was not a man who had spent much time before this in the consideration of domestic life. His 20s had been consumed by the building of his operation, the work of turning 400 acres of rough Panhandle into something that could sustain a livelihood, and sentiment had been something he set aside the way you set aside anything that could not be practically attended to right now. But Harriet Wells had a way of making everything sharper. She had walked into his life in a practical capacity schoolteacher, tenant, and had quietly, without any particular dramatic effort, become the person he thought of first when anything happened, the person he wanted to tell things to, the person whose opinion he considered before making significant decisions. He had not planned this. He was not sure it was the kind of thing a man could plan. He thought about the way she had looked in the doorway that morning. Arms crossed, holding herself together, not wanting to be seen crying. And then the red eyes when he came back and knocked on the door. She had not tried to explain the crying or excuse it. She had simply stood there in it, present and honest, the way she was about most things. He was going to come home and marry that woman the first week he was back. This decision, made somewhere in the Indian Territory under the enormous star-salted sky, settled something in him that had been restless since he rode away from her. Harriet's midpoint in those weeks was marked by an incident at the schoolhouse that turned out to be more consequential than it might have seemed. A family had come through Clarendon in mid-May, heading further west to take up land in the New Mexico Territory, and they had a daughter, 16, who had been receiving no schooling since they left Missouri the previous fall. Her name was Louise Crandall, and her parents were decent people who were exhausted from travel and grateful for even a week's worth of proper instruction before they moved on. Harriet took Louise into her schoolroom, assessed her abilities, and within 2 days understood that she was looking at one of the sharpest young minds she had encountered in her 3 years of teaching on the Panhandle. Louise Crandall could solve arithmetic problems that challenged Harriet's 14-year-olds. She read with the kind of depth and retention that was unusual at any age. She had a habit of connecting ideas from different subjects in ways that were startling and illuminating. She was also shy to the point of near silence, and the exhaustion of the overland journey had left her with a pallor and a quietness that might have looked like dullness to someone not paying attention. Harriet paid attention. She talked to the Crandalls in the evening, sitting at their camp, which they had set up at the edge of town while they resupplied. They were good people, Thomas and Mabel Crandall, practical and somewhat worn down by the uncertainties of the frontier. Thomas Crandall had the look of a man who had made his decision to go west and was committed to it even when he was not entirely sure it had been wise. "She's a remarkable student," Harriet told them. "Genuinely exceptional. I would not say this if I did not mean it." Mabel Crandall looked at her daughter across the firelight with the particular expression of a mother who knows her child's worth and has spent years watching the world fail to see it. "We know what Louise is," she said quietly. "What are your plans for her schooling when you reach New Mexico?" Harriet asked. The Crandalls exchanged a look that was small and honest and said more than words. There were no schools yet where they were going. There would be neighbors eventually, maybe a church, maybe in a few years something organized. But right now there was land and work and the enormous project of building a life from scratch, and schools came later. "She reads everything she can get her hands on," Thomas Crandall said. "We keep her supplied with books when we can manage it." Harriet nodded. She spent the rest of that evening doing something she was not sure she ought to do, but did anyway. She packed a crate with every book she could spare from her personal collection. She had 19, which was a considerable library by Panhandle standards, and brought it to the Crandall camp the next morning with a list of what was in it, and a note for Louise suggesting an order and a reading program that would take her through the next 2 years if she followed it. She had written the note as if to a younger colleague rather than a student, because that felt like the right thing. Louise Crandall received this crate with an expression that was very still and very full, the way a person looks when they have been given something they needed and had not known how to ask for. She looked up at Harriet and said, "How do I return them?" "You don't," Harriet said. "They're yours. When you have finished them all, write to me and tell me what you thought." Louise nodded. Then, impulsively and somewhat formally, she held out her hand to shake the way she had seen adults do it. Harriet shook it. She stood in the road, watching the Crandall wagon pull out 2 days later, and felt something that was not quite loneliness, but was adjacent to it. The good done and departed, leaving the dust of its passage. She hoped that girl found her way to something worthy of her. She suspected she would. Some people simply would. John's letter about the successful delivery of the cattle to the Dodge City yards arrived via the returning Prout rider, a man named Amos Gill who had the face of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors and was entirely at peace with this, on a bright afternoon in early June. The herd had made it. 1,168 head delivered, a percentage well within the acceptable range for a drive of this length. Prout was satisfied. The transaction with the Kansas buyers had been completed. The outfit would be heading south within the week. Harriet read the letter standing on her front step and then sat down on the step and put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying this time, just absorbing the relief of it. He was coming home. She had about 3 weeks to wait. She spent the first of those weeks in a deep cleaning of both her own house and, with Rodrigo's matter-of-fact permission, John's main house, which needed attention after 8 weeks of bachelor occupation by a man who was perfectly competent at everything except domestic detail. She scrubbed floors and aired blankets and addressed a mouse situation in the pantry, with the direct efficiency that Harriet brought to all problems. She also planted the kitchen garden at the main house, which had been prepared but unplanted because John had been too occupied with drive preparations in the spring. She planted beans and squash and tomatoes, and a row of marigolds along the border because marigolds kept certain insects at bay, and also because she liked them. Rodrigo, watching her work from a respectful distance, said one afternoon, "He is a good man, he will be glad of this." "I know he will," Harriet said, straightening up from the garden row. "How is Inez?" "Well. The youngest has a tooth now." "That seems early for a tooth," she said, interested. "She is a fast child," Rodrigo agreed, with a father's quiet pride. They stood in the evening light for a moment, comfortable with each other the way people are when they have worked side by side through several seasons and learned to trust each other's competence. "He is going to ask you to get married," Rodrigo said then, conversationally. "He already did," Harriet said. Rodrigo nodded, as though this confirmed a calculation he had already made. "Good," he said simply, and went back to his horses. The second week, Harriet dealt with an incident that involved 2 of her older students, a disputed claim about whose arithmetic answer was correct, and a thrown slate, which struck neither party but created an enormous noise and a small crisis of authority that required her full and determined attention. She resolved it by having both students demonstrate their work on the board in front of the class, discovering that both answers were wrong in different ways, and turning the entire episode into an impromptu lesson on the importance of checking your reasoning twice before you were confident enough to throw anything. The class found this somewhat more satisfying than a straightforward punishment. Harriet found herself thinking that John would have liked that story. In the third week, when she was beginning to genuinely feel the days stretching, Harold Prout arrived back in Clarendon with his outfit, trail-dusted and substantially cheerful about the results of the drive. He came down the main road with his hands riding loose around the remuda and his own broad figure in the lead, and the settlement came out to watch the way settlements did when the cattlemen came home, because that money and those men represented something central and real to the economy of everything out here. John was not with Prout's main group. Harriet, standing in front of the trading post where Agnes Fletcher had immediately appeared beside her with the instinct of someone who understood exactly what she was looking for in that column of returning riders, scanned the group with a calm that cost her more than she intended. Harold Prout reined in near her, because he was a man who understood what Harriet Wells was to John Yates even if it had never been formally announced. "He's behind a bit," Prout said immediately, because he could see what was in her face. "Stopped at the Vasquez crossing to see about a steer that got separated. Should be in before dark." "Is he well?" she asked. "Well as a man can be after 8 weeks on the trail," Prout said. "Better than well, I'd say. He did a fine job, Miss Wells. You tell him I said so." "You can tell him yourself," she said. Prout smiled, the kind of smile older men allow themselves when they see something they recognize and approve of. "I suppose I can," he said, and rode on. He was in before dark as promised. Harriet heard Absalom before she saw him, that particular long-strided sound that she had registered, without realizing it over 2 years of the horse being 100 yards from her front door. She was on her front step when John came through the gate, trail-worn and thin in the way that weeks of hard physical work and insufficient eating did to a person. his dark hair longer than when he had left and a growth of beard that he would certainly deal with before tomorrow. He was real and solid and present, and he was looking at her the way he had learned to look at her, direct and complete. He stopped Absalom at the fence and got down, a little stiffly because 8 weeks in the saddle left its marks. He came through the gate and she met him at the edge of the step, and he took both her hands in his dusty, calloused ones and held them and looked at her. "Hello, Harriet," he said. "Hello, John," she said. They stood like that for a moment, and then he pulled her in and held her, and she put her face against the side of his neck and felt the solid warmth of him, and the long weeks of the Panhandle sky and the watching and the waiting and the brave, sensible occupying of herself compressed into this single moment and then released. "You're thinner," she said into his collar. "Trail food," he said against her hair. "I planted the kitchen garden." "I saw," he said. "Marigolds. They keep the insects away." "I know why you plant marigolds," he said, and she could feel him smiling. "Harriet, I meant what I said before I left." "I know you did," she said. "I want to make it formal, soon, before the summer is out." She pulled back enough to look at him. She was not a woman who cried easily. The morning he left had been the exception rather than the rule, but she felt the warmth of it now in her throat, the full and certain knowledge of this. "The summer is almost half over," she said. "Then we'd better not wait long," he said. They were married in the second week of July, 1878. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Miles Atchley in the Clarendon Church, a small, square building of pale limestone that managed to look both austere and welcoming in the mid-afternoon light. Agnes Fletcher organized the reception with the kind of decisive energy she brought to everything, producing a table of food that was frankly remarkable given what was available in a Panhandle settlement of this size, including a proper cake made with dried fruit and honey that she announced had taken 3 attempts to get right, and that no one was to comment on its density. No one commented on its density. Harold Prout came, with his wife Clara, a small, sharp-eyed woman of 52 who had been living on the Panhandle for 20 years, and had opinions about everything, and was right about most of them. Rodrigo Vasquez came with Inez and all 4 of their children, and the youngest was indeed an admirably early-toothed baby, who regarded the proceedings from Inez's arms with the serene confidence of someone who had no concerns about the world. Calvin Briggs came in a shirt that was clearly new and had been pressed with somebody's assistance, and he stood in the back and grinned for most of the ceremony like a man who was privately very pleased with how things had worked out. The school children were not officially invited, but several of them appeared at the windows at various points, which Harriet pretended not to see because it seemed unkind to shoo them away from something this fine. She wore her best dress pale blue lawn, made for her in Clarendon by a woman named Dorothy Sims, who was a gifted seamstress in the classic frontier fashion, meaning she could create something beautiful from limited materials and considerable ingenuity. The dress had buttons from collar to waist and a skirt that moved well in the afternoon air. Harriet had put her hair up properly for possibly the 3rd time in 3 years on the Panhandle, and the effect surprised even her when she saw it in Agnes Fletcher's looking-glass that morning. John wore his good dark coat and a white shirt, and he had shaved carefully, and when she came down the church aisle toward him and he watched her coming with an expression that was still and serious and entirely without the careful guardedness he carried most of the time, she thought, "This is it. This is the place where I am supposed to be." He took her hands at the altar and they looked at each other while the Reverend spoke, and she was aware of the gathered community around them. These people who had become her people over 3 years of this hard, beautiful country, and she was aware of the afternoon light coming through the church's small windows, and she was aware most of all of John's hands holding hers, steady and certain. She said her vows in a clear voice. He said his in the quiet, deliberate way he said things that mattered, and she knew every word was true and considered, because those were the only words he ever offered. When it was done, when the Reverend declared them married, and the gathered company broke into the particular kind of spontaneous, wholehearted celebration that frontier settlements produce, because a wedding is an occasion of genuine and collective joy. John kissed her in the plain way he had of doing things, not performing it for the room but simply meaning it. And she kissed him back. And someone, she suspected Calvin Briggs, let out a whoop that bounced off the limestone walls. They received their guests with the ease of two people who had been building a shared life for long enough that the formal recognition of it felt like a completion rather than a beginning. Agnes Fletcher hugged Harriet with fierce brevity. Harold Prout shook John's hand with the grip of a man who is genuinely pleased and says so with his hands. Clara Prout told Harriet that she had made a sensible choice, and that sensible choices were the foundation of a good life, which was high praise from Clara Prout. Rodrigo Vasquez embraced John once, briefly and completely, in the way that men who have worked together through hard things embrace, and then stood beside him and said nothing, which was the fullest endorsement he had to give. They had the small house, Harriet's little clapboard house, which had been her home for 3 years, as their own for the first period, while the main house was properly organized and fitted for 2 people rather than one solitary man. This took about 3 weeks and resulted in a series of productive and occasionally heated negotiations about the arrangement of furniture that Harriet found both entertaining and revealing about exactly how John's mind worked when it came to domestic space, which was to say he had not previously thought about it at all, and was now thinking about it very carefully. "The writing desk goes by the window," she said. "The window faces west," he said. "The afternoon light will be in your eyes. The morning light from the east window will be better for actual work, and the afternoon glare is not as bad as you think." He considered this. "The east window is near the chimney. In winter I will wear a shawl," she said. He thought about this for a moment and then moved the desk to the east window. It was like that about most things. He was methodical and she was determined, and they had enough genuine respect for each other's reasoning that the negotiations tended to resolve in something both of them could live with, which is a better domestic system than most, and one that took some couples considerably longer to develop. The main house by September was a real home. She had curtains at the windows, plain, practical cotton, blue and cream, because she had no interest in elaborate decoration, but she believed in color. And the kitchen had been reorganized to actual functionality, and the bookshelves that John had built from reclaimed lumber in the back room held the 31 books that remained of her collection after the crate she had given Louise Crandall, plus the 4 that John owned, which were a Bible, a practical guide to Texas cattle grazing published in 1874, a slim volume of verse that he had owned since before he came west and that he never discussed, and a battered copy of a Dickens novel that Harriet had recognized with some surprise and from which she gathered certain additional information about John Yates that she had not previously had. "Oliver Twist," she said when she added it to the shelf. "A man left it at the bunkhouse years ago," he said, not looking up from the fence post he was working on in the yard. "It's been read several times," she said. "Has it?" he said. "The spine is very worn," she said. There was a pause. "Dickens writes a good story," John said. She smiled at the bookshelf. "He does," she agreed. Through the autumn of 1878, they settled into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that felt, to Harriet, like something she had been heading toward for a long time. John was not a demonstrative man in the public sense. He would not take her hand at the trading post or make speeches at community suppers. But in private he was consistently, attentively warm in ways that she had learned to read, and that meant more to her than any public gesture. He noticed things. He remembered things she had mentioned weeks earlier and acted on them without announcement. When she mentioned in October that the schoolhouse needed better winter light, he showed up 2 weeks later with Harold Prout and 2 additional ranch hands, and they spent a Saturday fitting the schoolhouse with an additional window, which was not a small project and which he mentioned to her simply by saying, after supper that evening, "Windows in." Should get better light come November. She had looked at him across the supper table and felt the full weight of being known and attended to by this particular person. "Thank you," she said. "The children need to read in winter," he said, as though it were entirely practical, which it was, and also entirely something else. In the spring of 1879, Harriet discovered she was expecting a child. She did the mental accounting first in the way she did everything, and established that the child would arrive in November or thereabouts. Then she sat with the knowledge for a day while she decided how she felt about it, which turned out to be thoroughly, wholly glad. She had not been sure before this moment whether she would be glad or terrified. She was glad. She was also, practically speaking, aware that being with child while running a schoolhouse on the Texas Panhandle presented certain logistical questions that would need to be addressed. She told John on a Sunday evening in their kitchen, with the supper things still on the table between them and the long spring sunset coming through the west window. "John," she said, "I'm going to have a baby." He was completely still for a moment. Then something crossed his face that she had not seen before, something wide open and unguarded and absolutely certain, and he stood up from his chair and came around the table to her and put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her. "When?" he asked, and his voice was not quite level. "November, I think," she said. He pulled her up and held her, and she could feel him breathing, a deep steadying breath, and she put her arms around him and held on. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am entirely well." He held her for a long time without speaking. She could feel his heart beating, steady and fast at the same time. She understood that what she was feeling against her was the fullness of what this meant to him, and she held him back with everything she had. The summer of 1879 was hot in the particular way the Texas Panhandle was hot. Not the humid press of the coast, but a dry, relentless brightness that turned the grass blonde and made the horizon shimmer. Harriet continued teaching through the summer term, which was shorter than the main year, and managed to negotiate with the school board, primarily Harold Prout, who was the board's most influential member, and Agnes Fletcher, who was not officially on the board but exercised more influence on it than anyone who was, an arrangement by which she would take the autumn term off after her confinement, and a younger woman from town, Matilda Bryce, who had received some education and was willing to attempt teaching under Harriet's guidance, would cover the schoolhouse until she returned. This was not a standard arrangement for 1879, and it required more negotiation than it should have, and Harriet was direct and specific in all of it. She was not leaving the teaching permanently. She was having a baby and taking a reasonable time to recover, and she expected to return in the spring. The board agreed, because when Harriet Wells took a position on something with that particular quiet firmness, the path of least resistance was agreement. John's cattle operation was doing well. The previous year's drive money, his pay as segundo, which had been substantial, had allowed him to extend his fencing, purchase 12 additional head of breeding stock, and put money aside for a second season. He was not a wealthy man, but he was building something real and solid, and he did it the same way he did everything, methodically, without waste, with a long view. He worried about Harriet through the summer, but quietly in the way he did most things. He checked on her water supply twice daily because the heat was serious and hydration mattered, which Harriet understood was care expressed in practical terms and received it accordingly. He took over the heavier kitchen work without discussion, simply appearing to do it in the evenings in a way that suggested it had always been part of the arrangement. He rode into Clarendon more frequently, which allowed her to ride less when the summer advanced and the heat was high. Agnes Fletcher appointed herself an unofficial medical authority, which her long experience on the frontier did actually provide some basis for, and appeared at the Yates property every Thursday morning with practical information and occasionally food. Inez Vasquez, who had 4 children and a fifth's knowledge of these matters, was a calm and reliable source of actual experience, and Harriet trusted her instincts. November arrived with a northerly wind that was not quite a blue norther but had intentions in that direction. On a Tuesday afternoon, the 3rd of November, with John in the house because Rodrigo had taken charge of the cattle work for the duration and had been given absolute authority to use his own judgment in all things for however long it took, with Agnes Fletcher present as the most experienced person available, and with Inez Vasquez also there because her presence was both useful and calming. In that setting, in the main house with its blue and cream curtains, and its 35 books on the wall and its kitchen with the good light, their son was born. John was in the main room when it happened, because that was where a husband waited while the women in the bedroom managed the work that had been managed by women in bedrooms since the beginning of time. He sat in the wooden chair by the fireplace, and he was very still. He was not a man who prayed formally or regularly, but in this hour he did something that was close enough to it, a direct and urgent communication with whatever ordered the universe, asking for Harriet's safety with the full weight of everything he was. When Agnes Fletcher opened the bedroom door and said, "John, come and meet your son," her voice was entirely matter-of-fact and entirely warm. He stood so fast he knocked the chair sideways. The baby was small and red and absolutely furious about the indignity of the whole situation, and he had John's dark hair and Harriet's gray eyes, and an expression of outraged dignity that made both Agnes and Inez laugh, and that Harriet, exhausted and luminous in the disheveled aftermath of the most significant work she had ever done, found deeply funny. John sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and then at the bundle she was holding, and something happened in his face that none of the women in the room had ever seen on it before, a complete and unguarded wonder. "He's angry," he said. "He has opinions," Harriet said. "He's very small," John said. "He won't be," Agnes Fletcher said from the doorway. "None of them stay small." John put out one careful finger, and the baby, whose opinions were apparently flexible, wrapped his fist around it with a grip that was surprisingly firm for someone 11 minutes old. "Thomas," Harriet said. John looked at her. "I thought Thomas," she said. "For the name. What do you think?" He looked at the baby, at Thomas, and then at her. "I think it's a good name," he said, and his voice was very quiet. Thomas Wells Yates was, indeed, a fast child. He arrived at milestones ahead of the general schedule and approached the world with the combination of methodical determination and clear-eyed curiosity that suggested he had perhaps combined the most characteristic qualities of both his parents and decided to proceed with all of them simultaneously. He was walking well before his first birthday, talking in determined sentences by 18 months, and by 2 had a particular interest in how the horses moved that Rodrigo identified as the beginning of a horseman's eye. Harriet returned to the schoolhouse in March of 1880, as she had planned, leaving Thomas in Inez Vasquez's capable care on mornings when John was in the field. This arrangement worked well, partly because Inez was extraordinary with children, and partly because Thomas, from a very early age, had a sociable and adaptable nature that made him comfortable with most people most of the time. The school had functioned adequately under Matilda Bryce, who turned out to have a genuine aptitude for teaching younger children that Harriet had somewhat underestimated. They developed, over the following months, a productive partnership. Harriet handled the older students and the curriculum planning. Matilda handled the younger grades with an instinctive gentleness that suited them well. The school became, in practice, better equipped to serve the community than it had been when it had only one teacher, which pleased Harriet and confirmed her long-standing view that the settlement needed and deserved a properly organized school. John's second cattle drive in the spring of 1880 was his own. Harold Prout offered him the senior trail boss position again, but John had been thinking, through the winter, about his own operation. He had built the herd to the point where he could consider his own drive, small by the standards of a full Texas operation, 380 head, but enough to make the Dodge City run worthwhile on his own terms. He organized it with Rodrigo as his right hand and hired 3 additional trail hands from the county, including a young man named Pete Delaney, who came highly recommended by 2 separate ranchers and turned out to deserve that recommendation. Harriet stood in the doorway of the main house this time, their house, with the blue curtains and the marigold border and the books on the shelves, and Thomas sat on her hip, 16 months old, and regarding his father's departure with the tolerant curiosity of a child who did not yet understand what long absence meant, but was perfectly comfortable being held by his mother while it was arranged. John came to them both at the door before he rode out. He kissed Harriet fully and with intention, and she held the back of his neck for a moment with her free hand. Then he lifted Thomas and held him up and said something low and direct that Harriet did not quite hear, but that made Thomas laugh, that high, complete baby laugh that was still one of the more extraordinary sounds she had encountered. He handed Thomas back to her, settled his hat, and rode. She did not cry this time. She stood in the doorway with Thomas on her hip and watched until John crested the first ridge, and she raised her hand and he raised his, and she turned back inside. This was different. Not because she missed him less. She did not miss him less, but because the shape of the life they had built was solid around her now, and the waiting had a texture to it that was full rather than hollow. There was Thomas, and there was the school, and there was the rhythm of the ranch under Rodrigo's management, and there were the neighbors and the community that had become genuinely hers over 5 years on the Panhandle. She was not a woman waiting for her life to resume. She was a woman whose life was continuous and inhabited, whose husband was doing necessary work, and who would come home. A letter came from Louise Crandall in June of 1880. It had been forwarded twice, first to Clarendon from the New Mexico address Harriet had sent her own letters to, and then rerouted from a community mail point. Louise and her family had moved again, further northwest, establishing on land near the Arizona border. The letter was written with the careful, slightly formal precision of a young woman who took writing seriously and was aware of doing so. Louise was 18 now. She had read all 31 books Harriet had sent with her, some of them 3 times. She was teaching 2 neighboring children their letters because there was no school within reach, and their mothers had asked her if she could manage it, and she had managed it and discovered she liked it. She was wondering, she wrote, whether Harriet might know of any way for a young woman in a remote frontier area to pursue formal teacher qualification, because she thought she wanted to teach. She thought it was what she was supposed to do. Harriet wrote back the same week. She wrote to the county education office in Prescott, Arizona Territory, with a formal letter of recommendation that she considered one of the strongest she had ever written. She wrote to a teacher's college in Kansas City that she had knowledge of and explained the situation. She wrote 3 letters in 3 days on behalf of a girl she had known for 1 week, and then let go into the wide country, because that was what the girl needed, and Harriet was not a woman who was careless with need. The thing about letters on the frontier in 1880 was that they took a very long time. You sent them and you waited and you went on about your life, and the response arrived when it arrived, weeks or months later, like a message from another season. This was simply how it was. John's drive returned in August, successful, and in the context of 380 head launched and 361 delivered profitable beyond what he had conservatively estimated. He came home thinner again and trail-marked, and as Harriet registered immediately, something more settled in his bearing. The satisfaction of his own drive, his own operation, his own success built on his own terms. He was 29 years old and had done what he came to the Panhandle to do, and it showed in him. Thomas, now 19 months old and substantially more mobile than the last time he had seen his father, toddled across the main room toward him with the urgency of someone who had important business to conduct. John crouched to his level and received the full impact of his son with a contained, complete joy That was one of the things Harriet filed quietly in the archive of moments she would never stop being glad happened. That evening, after Thomas was asleep and the supper things were cleared and they were sitting together in the main room with the late summer dusk coming through the windows, John reached across and took her hand. "I want to talk about the operation," he said. "All right," she said. "I want to expand. Properly. The southern section of Pruitt's land, the part he's been talking about selling if we can get it, and if we push the herd to 800 head over the next 2 years, we're looking at a real operation. Something that's here for a long time." Harriet looked at him. She had the practical intelligence to follow this kind of planning and the interest in it that came from having been genuinely invested in this land and this life for going on 5 years. "What does it cost?" she asked. He told her. They talked through it fully, the way they discussed all significant things, completely, with both of them present and both of them thinking. The question of the school came into it. She had no intention of leaving the school, and the income from teaching was not negligible, and the question of expanding the house if the operation grew, and the question of what Rodrigo's role would look like as the herd doubled. These were real, specific, consequential questions, and they addressed all of them. "I think we should do it," Harriet said at the end. John nodded. He had the look of a man who had thought it through 100 times and was glad to have it confirmed by the person whose confirmation meant most. "Good," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and they sat in the quiet summer evening, and the coyotes called somewhere out in the dark grass, and Thomas made some small sound in the next room and then was still again. "John," she said, "I heard from Louise Crandall." He knew the story. She had told him about the Crandall family and Louise the previous year. "How is she?" "She wants to be a teacher," Harriet said. "She's teaching neighbor children already, self-organized." "That sounds familiar," John said. "It does somewhat," Harriet agreed. "I wrote some letters on her behalf." "You would," he said, and there was something so warm in how he said it, not admiring exactly, more just recognizing her completely and approving of the recognition, that she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. The following years were the years of building. In 1881, John purchased the southern section of Pruitt's land. Pruitt was reducing his operation at 68, not entirely by choice, as his health had been showing certain signals that Clara Pruitt read correctly and acted upon with quiet, firm efficiency, and the Yates operation expanded. Rodrigo took on an expanded role as range foreman, which was a title that correctly reflected what he had been doing informally for 2 years, and he brought on 2 additional hands, both Mexican vaqueros of his own acquaintance, men named Felix and Domingo, who were experienced and quiet, and who integrated into the work of the ranch with the smoothness of people who had spent their whole lives in exactly this kind of work. It was a matter of simple truth that the Panhandle's cattle economy rested enormously on the skills and labor of Mexican vaqueros, and had done so since before there was an American Texas to speak of. The knowledge of horses and cattle, and the open range that men like Rodrigo carried, was knowledge that had been developed over generations, and that was often received without credit or acknowledgement by the Anglo cattlemen who depended on it absolutely. John Yates paid fair wages and treated his hands with the respect of a man who understood what they knew that he did not, and this was not universal in the county, and it made a difference to the kind of operation the Yates Ranch became, one where men stayed, where loyalty was earned and reciprocated, where the work was hard but the terms were honest. Harriet kept the school. Matilda Bryce had, by 1881, become a genuinely capable teacher in her own right, and the 2 women ran what was, by Panhandle standards, an exceptional educational operation. They had 15 students regularly enrolled, ranging across ages, and the books that Harriet had been systematically requesting from the county board and occasionally purchasing from her own income had built a real classroom library of 11 volumes. This was a significant resource. Agnes Fletcher donated to it regularly, routing books she had finished through the school library with a businesslike generosity that she described as practicality. A letter from Louise Crandall arrived in 1882. She had received a formal qualification through a program organized by the Arizona Territory Education Office. The letters Harriet had written had apparently done their work, reaching people who could act on them. She was teaching in a newly established school in a small settlement near the Arizona border. She had 23 students. She wrote with the measured, full confidence of a young woman who had found her right work, and she sent with the letter a list of the books she had found most useful in her teaching, which Harriet read with close attention and shared with Matilda. She wrote back, "I am so proud of what you have built. This is what you were supposed to do. Don't stop." By 1883, the Yates Ranch was 840 head, which was exactly what John had planned and exactly when he had planned it. The southern section was fully integrated. Rodrigo had hired and kept good hands. The operation had a reputation in the county for producing quality stock and for running cleanly. John was 32 years old and had built what he came to Texas to build. Thomas was 4, still blond in the way that young children sometimes are before darkening, still with his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's absolute attention to whatever he was doing at any given moment. He had a particular bond with Rodrigo, who taught him things about horses with a patient thoroughness that Harriet found both touching and entirely sensible. He also had a habit of appearing in the schoolroom when Harriet was there, sitting quietly in the back corner, and attending to whatever was being taught with an interested, self-contained focus that several of her students found slightly intimidating in a 4-year-old. In the autumn of 1883, Harriet was once again expecting. This time, she told John earlier, she was more certain of the signs, more comfortable with the knowledge. On a Saturday morning in October when they were at the kitchen table with their coffee. "I think we'll have another one," she said. He looked at her. The same stillness, but she knew it now, could read it, not shock but the adjustment to something large and good. When he asked, "May I think?" he nodded slowly. He put his coffee cup down and reached across the table, and she gave him her hand. They sat like that for a moment. "Thomas will be glad," he said. "Thomas will be bossy," she said. "He gets that from someone," John said. She looked at him. "That's an interesting thing to say." "I thought so," he said, and she could see him not quite smiling. The baby was born in June of 1884, on a warm morning with the prairie wind easy through the open windows. A daughter, small and definite, with Harriet's brown hair and John's dark eyes, and an expression of serene assessment that suggested she had arrived prepared to evaluate the situation before committing to any strong response. Thomas, 4.5 and a person of considerable opinions, stood beside the bed and looked at his sister with an expression that moved through several stages: initial uncertainty, reevaluation, and then something that settled into a proprietary protectiveness that Harriet recognized immediately as the beginning of a long and occasionally infuriating big brotherhood. "She's little," Thomas said. "She's new," John said. "What's her name?" John and Harriet looked at each other. "Clara," Harriet said. After Clara Pruitt, who had died that winter at 73, sharp and useful to the end, having organized her own affairs with brisk efficiency and left the Yates household a substantial portion of her personal library because she said Harriet was the only person in the county who would actually read it. "Is that all right with you, Clara Yates?" John said, trying it. "Yes, that's right." Clara Wells Yates was the kind of child who created the impression of being entirely calm while actually missing nothing. She was observant and quiet and had a laugh, when she produced it, that was so full and surprised-sounding that it made everyone around her laugh too. She and Thomas developed over the next years the kind of sibling relationship that was composed equally of conflict and loyalty. They bickered constantly about specific things, and were absolutely unified in the face of anything external. The years settled into their good, full shape. Harold Pruitt died in 1885, peacefully in his own bed at 69, with Clara's careful preparations having arranged everything with typical prude efficiency. His passing left the county feeling somewhat smaller, the way places feel when the people who helped build them are gone. John attended the burial and stood with his hat in his hands and said nothing, the way he had been at the church when they buried other people who had mattered, entirely present and entirely private. Rodrigo Vasquez, at 49, was still the best range foreman in the county and showed no signs of any other trajectory. His eldest son, Manuel, was 17 by 1885 and had begun working the ranch alongside his father, which created a continuity in the operation that John recognized and respected. He spoke to Rodrigo about the future of the foreman's role, and Rodrigo, characteristically, said very little and agreed to everything with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to all his work. Calvin Briggs had, by 1885, been through several rodeo competitions, one near disaster with a loan he could not pay back from which John had quietly helped him extricate himself without making it a larger thing than it needed to be, and a brief and apparently unsuccessful courtship of a woman in a neighboring county. He was 29 now and had grown, in the years of working the Yates ranch, from an enthusiastic young man of uncertain competence into a genuinely skilled cowhand who still talked too much but was worth listening to. The school in 1885 had 18 students and a third teacher, a young man named Arthur Dent, who had recently arrived from Ohio, and who had certain old-fashioned ideas about educational discipline that Harriet spent the first 3 months redirecting with the patient, firm precision she had long since mastered. By the 4th month, Arthur Dent was teaching mathematics to the older students with considerable effectiveness, and had developed a respect for Harriet Wells Yates that came through in every aspect of how he conducted himself in her school. He was, in her private assessment, going to become an excellent teacher, and she told him so, which she observed was the most galvanizing thing she could have done for his professional development. A letter arrived in 1886 from Louise Crandall. She was 24 now. Her school near the Arizona border had grown to 30 students. She had recently been appointed to oversee the curriculum for 2 additional schools in adjacent communities, a role that had no real precedent in the territory, but that the county board had created, because it became evident that Louise Crandall was doing something that needed to be organized and formalized. She wrote that she was also planning to be married in the spring to a farmer named Daniel Hooper, who was 26 and kind, and who understood what the school meant to her. She wrote, "I am telling you this because you are part of how this happened. You gave me books and told me to write, and I wrote. I don't know what I would have been without those books." Harriet read this letter twice and then called to John from the kitchen table. He came in from the yard, bringing the scent of fresh air and horses, and she handed him the letter. He read it standing up, still wearing his hat. When he finished, he handed it back. "You did that," he said. "She did that," Harriet said. "I just sent some books." "Harriet," he said, with the quiet exactness he reserved for things that needed to be said precisely, "you saw who she was and you acted on it. You don't have to minimize that." She looked at him. He was not a man who made speeches, and this was not a speech. It was a fact stated plainly, but it landed the way it was intended, and she felt it. "I'm going to send her a wedding gift," she said. "Of course you are," he said, and went back out to the yard. Thomas turned 8 in 1882. He turned 10 in 1884. He turned 12 in 1886, and the boy who had toddled across the main room toward his returning father was now a person who rode with Rodrigo's deliberate permission and under his patient instruction, who attended school with Harriet's own demanding expectations fully applied to him. She was entirely willing to teach her own children and entirely unwilling to make allowances for them, and who had begun to show certain qualities that both his parents recognized and neither made too much of. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's quickness, and he had something of his own that was neither, a kind of easy social ability, a facility with people that was not like either of his parents exactly. John was respected but private. Harriet was engaged but sometimes ahead of the room. Thomas moved through his world with a natural warmth that people responded to, and that, when combined with his father's stubbornness and his mother's intelligence, suggested a person who would eventually do something fairly formidable with his life. Clara, too, at Christmas of 1886, was what Agnes Fletcher described as a personality, by which she meant something wholly complimentary. She had opinions about everything, expressed them without apology, and was curious about the natural world in a way that led to various encounters with things that lived in the grass and under rocks that Harriet found requiring more equanimity than she naturally possessed. John, who had a pragmatic relationship with all things that lived in the natural environment, was considerably better at these encounters than Harriet. "There is a large tarantula on the back porch," Harriet said, one autumn evening. "Clara's," John said. "I believe so. I'll speak to her." "Please," Harriet said. The conversation between John and Clara regarding the appropriate boundaries of tarantula-related collection was one that Harriet, listening from the kitchen, found deeply characteristic of both parties. John matter-of-fact and clear, Clara making reasoned counterarguments about the tarantula's qualities and intentions, John unmoved on the central point while entirely respectful of the reasoning. The tarantula was returned to the grass. Clara accepted this with the pragmatism of someone who was already planning the next attempt. In the winter of 1887, Agnes Fletcher, at 70, announced her intention to close the trading post and retire to a small house she had purchased in Clarendon proper, to be closer to the church and the community, and she said without particular sentiment, to have someone find her quickly when the time came. She said this in the direct way she said all things, without requesting sympathy or making it into occasion, and Harriet received it the same way. The trading post passed to a younger couple, the Hendersons, who ran it with reasonable competence if somewhat less personality than Agnes had brought to 30 years of it. Harriet made it a point to visit Agnes Fletcher twice a week through the winter and the following spring, bringing food and books, and the kind of frank, engaged conversation that Agnes had always preferred to sentiment. They sat in Agnes's small parlor and talked about the county and the school and the larger currents of the world. It was 1887, and the country was moving, the great cattle empire of the open range already beginning to show the pressures of barbed wire and land claims, and the inevitable closing of the frontier, and Agnes had opinions about all of it that were sharp and usually accurate. "The range days are ending," Agnes said, one February afternoon. "Your husband knows it." "He's been fencing," Harriet said. "Smart man," Agnes said. She regarded Harriet from her chair with the direct assessment she had always used. "You've been good for him, you know, and he for you. That's not as common as people pretend." "I know," Harriet said quietly. "I've been watching marriages in this county for 30 years, Agnes said. "Some of them are business arrangements wearing a different name. Some of them are habit. Yours is," she paused, choosing. "Yours is actual." Harriet did not speak for a moment. "It is," she said. Agnes nodded, satisfied, and picked up her cup. "How's the girl, Clara?" "She has released the tarantula," Harriet said. "For now," Agnes said. "For now," Harriet agreed. Agnes Fletcher died peacefully on a night in March of 1888, at 71, in her own bed, in the small house she had chosen to be in. The Reverend Atchley, still going at 62, performed the service, and most of the county came, because Agnes Fletcher had been part of the architecture of this place for so long that her absence was a structural thing, felt in the foundations. Harriet stood at the graveside with John beside her and Thomas on her other side. He was 13 and understood what death was in the full human sense now, and Clara in John's arms, because she was 4 and her legs were not long enough for a walk this distance. Harriet felt the loss cleanly, the way she had come to feel the losses that came with a life long enough to have real history in it. Agnes had been 71 and sharp-minded and complete. The grief was clean because the life had been full. That evening, home in their kitchen with the children fed and settled and the fire low, John sat across from her and said, "How are you?" She considered this because he was asking it specifically, not as a pleasantry. "Sad," she said. "Grateful, both at the same time." He nodded. He reached across the table and covered her hand. They sat with the fire and the dark outside and the sound of the wind over the grass, which was the sound that had been the background of Harriet Wells's life for 13 years now, and which she could no longer imagine not hearing. "She told me once," Harriet said, "the first week I was here when I came in to buy flour, and she asked me what I was doing out here. She said, 'This country doesn't make room for you, you make room in it.' I didn't really understand that then. I think I do now." John was quiet for a moment. "You made room," he said. "We did," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. The following years were the years of full harvest in all the ways the word applied. The Yates Ranch continued its growth, managed now with the precision of an operation that had found its right scale and its right method. Manuel Vasquez had, by 1890, taken on a larger share of the foreman's daily responsibilities as Rodrigo, at 54, shifted toward oversight and training, which was where his deepest knowledge was most valuable. John trusted Manuel with the same completeness he had always trusted Rodrigo, because Manuel had been trained in the same school and had the same qualities. Thomas, at 14 in 1892, was working the ranch summers alongside his schoolwork, not because John required it, but because he wanted to understand the work that was the foundation of his family's life. He was a natural horseman. Rodrigo said this without embellishment, which meant it was true, and he had his mother's gift for reading a situation quickly. He was also growing taller with a rapidity that seemed to surprise even himself, and had developed an interest in mechanical principles that had no direct application on a cattle ranch, but that John, who believed in following a mind where it needed to go, encouraged by getting him access to everything available on the subject, which on the Panhandle in 1892 was not extensive but was something. Clara, at 8, was in her mother's school and making her mother's professional commitment to fairness work very hard. She was not a difficult student. She was quick and engaged and genuinely interested, but she had an inborn talent for the kind of question that exposed the gap between a stated principle and its actual application, which was both intellectually admirable and occasionally exhausting. Matilda Bryce, who now had children of her own and had been teaching for 12 years, handled Clara with a combination of amusement and respect that Harriet thought was exactly right. John, at 41 in 1892, was a man who had arrived at the particular satisfaction of someone who had built what he meant to build and was now living inside it. The restlessness that had driven him out of Georgia at 19 was fully resolved, not suppressed, resolved, because he had found the thing that answered it. He was still lean and still dark-haired, with a thread of gray now at his temples that Harriet found, though she did not say this aloud, very handsome. He was quieter than he had been, in the way that men who have established their place in the world no longer need to be in motion all the time. He sat some evenings on the porch with a cup of coffee and looked out at his land, at their land, with an ease that was the most complete contentment Harriet had ever seen in a person. She would sometimes sit beside him in the second chair, and they would watch the evening come across the grass, and they did not always need to speak. Two people who knew each other entirely and who were at home together in the most complete sense of the word. There were still things that required the kind of honesty they had always given each other. The country was changing. The open range was not open anymore. The vast communal grazing lands that had been the foundation of the Texas cattle economy were being fenced and claimed and parceled, and the era of the great drives was effectively over by the early 1890s. The Yates operation had adapted, partly because John had seen it coming and had been managing toward a different model for years: better breeding stock, more selective selling, a more settled operation that did not depend on the long trail market. But the change was real and it required adjustment, and the adjustment was not without cost. Two of the older hands men who had been working the open range since before John came to Texas left, not in any bad way, but because the work was changing into something different from what they had given their lives to, and they needed to find the version of it that still existed somewhere, if it still did. John watched them go with the respect of a man who understood what they were losing and did not try to minimize it. The decade turned to 1893 and then to 1895, and the Yates Ranch continued. Thomas went east for 1 year to a technical college in 1896. He was 21, and the mechanical interest had become specific. Engines, which were becoming a real and consequential presence in the world, even if on the Panhandle their arrival was still some years off. He went with his parents' full support and came back after the year with more knowledge and a more developed sense of what he wanted to do with it, and settled back into the ranch with the intention of being both his father's son and his own person, which is exactly the right intention. Clara, at 12 in 1896, was already certain she was going to teach. She told her mother this with the calm directness of someone stating a geographic fact. Harriet received it with an equally calm directness, and then spent a quiet moment in the kitchen alone being so thoroughly glad about it that she had to sit down. She wrote to Louise Hooper, née Crandall, that week. They were still corresponding, had been for 18 years now, two teachers at different ends of a wide territory finding in each other the kind of professional and personal resonance that sustained long careers. And she wrote about Clara's announcement with the honesty that had always characterized their letters. Louise wrote back that it sounded exactly right, and that the teaching life was a full one if you went at it properly, and she was certain Clara would go at it properly. Louise had 3 children by 1896, all in school, one of them already showing, at 8, the same analytical sharpness that Louise herself had shown at 16. Louise wrote about this with a mother's combination of pride and barely suppressed alarm. Harriet wrote back that this was exactly what it was like, and she was sorry, and also not sorry at all. By 1898, the Yates household had settled into the particular richness of a life well built and well inhabited. Thomas was 23, working the ranch and beginning, with his father's involvement and his own mechanical knowledge, to investigate how the new technology emerging in American industry might be applicable, eventually, to the operation's future. He was courting a young woman named Rebecca Hale, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, 21 years old and possessed of a practical good sense, and a warm temperament that Harriet thought suited Thomas well, and that John, characteristically, expressed his approval of by simply treating Rebecca as part of the household from the second time she came to Sunday dinner. Clara was 14 in 1898 and ferociously engaged in every aspect of her education, which she was receiving partly from the school, partly from Harriet's systematic and not entirely disinterested home curriculum, and partly from the library that now occupied the entirety of one wall of the main house's back room, having expanded, over 20 years of selective acquisition, to 114 volumes, which was a collection remarkable enough that people from neighboring counties sometimes asked to borrow from it. Rodrigo Vasquez, at 62, was still on the ranch, though his role was primarily advisory now. When he walked through the cattle with Manuel or stood at the fence and watched the horses, he was doing what he had always done, seeing what needed seeing and understanding what needed understanding. He and John had known each other for 20 years, which was long enough to require almost no words. Harriet, at 44, was in her full power as a teacher and a person. The gray in her brown hair she wore without apology. The lines at the corners of her gray-green eyes were the lines of a woman who had lived in sunlight and weather and expression for a long time, and they were honest. She was the same woman who had come to the Panhandle at 21 because she was looking for something real, and she had found it in such abundance and in such specific detail that she sometimes still stopped for a moment and simply registered the enormous good fortune of it. She and John, on a September evening in 1898, sat on the porch as they so often did, watching the last light go off the grass in long gold stripes, and Thomas and Rebecca were inside making considerable noise in the kitchen about something that was either an argument or an entertainment. It was hard to tell with them, and Clara was at the table in the main room writing an essay for school in the focused silence of someone who takes writing seriously. 20 years, John said. She looked at him. He was looking at the land, at the evening, at the accumulated weight of everything that was theirs. 20 years next July, she said, since you rode back from that ridge. He turned to look at her. In the evening light, with the gray at his temples and the ease in his face, he was the same man who had stood at her door and held his hat in both hands and said things he had been working up to, and also a completely different man, the man he had become in 20 years of this life beside her. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "Riding back," she said. "Riding back," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it in his, and they sat in the September evening while the light went, and the stars began their regular, unhurried appearance. The same stars that had been there in 1878 when they were beginning, and that were here now in all this fullness. "What do you think about next summer?" she said. "For the anniversary, Thomas has said something about a celebration, and I think if we don't plan it ourselves it will become something very large." "It should be something quiet," he said. "I agree," she said, "quiet and full. Dinner here," he said, "the people who matter." "Yes," she said, "exactly." They planned it in the practical, specific way they planned most things, and it was settled in 10 minutes, and then they sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them. From inside, Clara's voice rose briefly, arguing some point with her own essay, audible in the particular intense self-dialogue that she conducted when she was working something out. Thomas laughed at something Rebecca said in the kitchen. Somewhere out on the grass, a night bird called twice. In the summer of 1899, Thomas Wells Yates married Rebecca Hale on a Saturday afternoon in the Clarendon church. The same church where his parents had married 21 years before, the same pale limestone walls, the same long windows, though Reverend Atchley had retired and been succeeded by a younger man. Thomas stood at the altar with the ease of a man who knew exactly where he was and why, and Rebecca came down the aisle with a particular kind of steadiness that Harriet thought was one of the best qualities a person could bring to a marriage. Harriet sat in the front pew with John beside her and felt the continuity of it, the long thread of it, this moment connected to all the moments before it. John had his hand over hers on her knee, the way he so often did, and she looked at her son at the altar and thought of the 19-month-old who had toddled across the main room and grabbed his father's finger, and the 4-year-old who had stood beside the bed and declared his sister little, and the boy who had ridden out with Rodrigo and come home smelling of horses and grass, and the young man who had gone east for a year with tools in his mind, and this man now, 24 years old and standing exactly where he was supposed to stand. She felt John's thumb move, a small gesture against her hand. She looked at him. He was watching their son the same way she was. They did not need to say anything about it. Clara, 15 and already more certain of herself than most adults Harriet had ever met, served as one of the wedding party with a dignity that impressed even the oldest guests and a secret delight in the proceedings that she permitted to show in exactly one unguarded smile during the vows, which she directed at her mother, and which Harriet received with a smile of her own that was entirely unguarded. The anniversary dinner in July of 1899, 21 years from the wedding, 21 years from the morning John rode back from the first ridge and knocked on her door, was quiet and full, as they had planned. Rodrigo and Inez came, with Manuel and his wife, a young woman from Clarendon named Elena who had been part of the community for 5 years. Thomas and Rebecca came. Clara was there. Calvin Briggs, at 43, still working the ranch and still talking too much and still possessed of a genuine warmth that had survived all his years on the Panhandle, came and brought a woman named Pearl who he described as his very good friend, and who was clearly more than that. A development the table received with the kind of understated encouragement that people give when they think something is long overdue, and are not going to say so directly. Harriet had cooked salt pork and fried potatoes and cornbread, the same as the last dinner she had made before John rode out in 1878. This was deliberate. She had not said this to anyone else, had not explained it, but John noticed immediately when they sat down, and he looked at her across the table with the full, quiet attention she had been receiving from him for 20 years. "This is the same meal," he said. "I know," she said. He held her eyes for a moment. "Why?" "Because I wanted to remember where we started," she said, "and look at where we ended up." He looked around the table, their son and his wife, their daughter, Rodrigo and Inez, and the decades of trust and work they represented, Calvin Briggs being warmly verbose, the faces of people who were the accumulated community of a life built in a country that had not given anything easily. He looked back at her. "We haven't ended up yet," he said, "but I know what you mean." "Good," she said. The dinner was long and good, and full of the kind of laughter that happens between people who have known each other through hard things, and come out the other side into something solid. Outside, the July stars were the same stars they had always been, vast and indifferent and beautiful, spread across the Panhandle sky from one edge to the other. After the guests were gone and Clara was asleep and the house was quiet, Harriet and John stood on the porch together in the warm night. Not sitting standing, the way they had been the morning he came back from the ridge, both of them on the same threshold. 21 years, she said softly. "The land's better," he said. "Fencing held. Herd is good. Thomas is married. Clara is Clara," Harriet said. "Yes," he agreed. "That's a lot." She turned to him and he put his arms around her and she rested her head against his chest and heard his heartbeat, steady as it had always been, the most familiar sound she knew. "When you came back from that ridge," she said, "what made you turn around?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was answering honestly rather than quickly. "I saw your doorway from the top," he said. "I could see you'd gone inside, and I thought," he paused. "I thought if I don't go back right now, that is the thing I will regret when I am very old, above everything else." She pressed her face against his chest. "You were right," she said. "I know," he said. They stood like that in the warm July night. On the porch of the house they had built together in the country they had made their own, with the grass moving in the dark wind and the stars burning cold and far above, and the whole of their life around them like something solid and true and entirely, completely theirs. In the autumn of 1900, Rebecca Yates delivered a son, John, and Harriet's first grandchild, born on an October morning when the first hints of the coming century were everywhere in the air, a world turning with the momentum of things yet to come, but standing here still on the threshold of everything that had been. They named him Robert. He was small and furious and dark-haired, and when John held him for the first time and looked down at the child in his arms with that same unguarded wonder he had shown 20 years before when Thomas was new, Harriet stood beside him and felt the long continuity of it pass through her like light through a prism, breaking into all its colors. Thomas, 25 and a father now, stood against the wall of the bedroom with an expression that was simultaneously terrified and incandescent. Rebecca lay in the bed, tired and luminous, watching her husband discover fatherhood. "He's very small," Thomas said. "He won't be," Harriet said. John looked up from the baby to Harriet, and she saw the smile that was in his eyes, private and complete, the one she had been reading for 22 years. "None of them stay small," he said, and she recognized the echo of something Agnes Fletcher had said in another room a long time ago, and she was glad that Agnes's words were still living in the world, passing forward through the people who had heard them. Clara, 16 in 1900, and already corresponding with a teacher's college in the East about her plans for formal qualification, came to see her nephew with a solemnity, and then a swift, astonished softening when the baby turned his head and seemed, in the way that newborns seem to do despite all logic, to look directly at her. "Hello," Clara said to Robert, very quietly. Robert had no immediate response, but his expression modulated in a way that Clara found satisfying. She looked up at her parents. "He's going to be all right," she pronounced. John looked at Harriet. Harriet pressed her lips together against a smile. "Yes," she said, "I think he is." The Texas Panhandle in 1900 was a different place than it had been in 1878. The open range was gone. The great cattle drives were history, remembered by men like Rodrigo with a quiet respect for what they had been and a clear-eyed recognition that the world moved on whether you were ready or not. Towns had grown. Railroads had reached closer. The isolation that had been the fundamental condition of frontier life was easing, slowly, into something more connected, more complicated, more full of the future. The Yates Ranch sat in all of this with the groundedness of something that had been carefully built and carefully tended. It was not the largest operation in the county. It had never tried to be, but it was one of the most solid and the most honestly run, and it had been doing what it did for 22 years in the same place with the same principles and the same people. And that meant something in a land where so many things had come and gone with the urgency of a frontier economy and the fragility of things built too fast. John, at 49, was still lean and still capable, and still the man who thought carefully before he spoke and acted on what he thought with full commitment. He was also, Harriet reflected, considerably more willing to say directly what he felt than the man who had stood in her doorway 22 years ago making himself put the words together. The years had done that. The life they had lived together had done that. When you have someone who listens completely, you learn to speak fully. Harriet, at 46, was teaching still. She intended to teach until she could not, and there was no indication of that time arriving soon. She had built something in that schoolhouse over 25 years that was genuinely real students who had gone on to other lives carrying the marks of what they had learned there. Teachers like Matilda Bryce and Arthur Dent, who had come through her school and become themselves. A small but real library. A reputation for rigor and care that brought families to the settlement specifically for the school's sake. She was not given to calculating this kind of thing, but if she had been, she would have understood that she had done something that mattered. She still wrote to Louise Hooper. They had been corresponding for 22 years. Louise's school had grown into something significant in the Arizona territory, and Louise herself had become a figure of some influence in territorial education, which Harriet thought was entirely right and inevitable and wonderful. She still had the letter John had written on the trail, from inside an envelope in 1878. The cedar box on the windowsill held it along with a few other things. A pressed flower from the first summer they spent together, a small photograph taken in 1883 when a photographer came through Clarendon, Thomas and Clara's first drawings, a lock of each child's hair, a note from Agnes Fletcher that said simply, "You built something real. That matters." On an evening in late October of 1900, with the harvest done and the cattle settled and Robert 3 weeks old and peaceful in the main house with Thomas and Rebecca, with Clara studying at the table, and the fire going and the dark coming early as it did in autumn, Harriet sat at the kitchen table and looked at John across from her. He was reading the Dickens, which had worn even further with the years, and the lamplight was on his face, and the fire was warm, and the wind was moving over the grass outside with its usual unconcerned permanence. She thought about the morning in the spring of 1878 when she had stood in a different doorway and watched him ride out and wept despite herself. She thought about him on Absalom at the top of the first ridge deciding. She thought about the knock on the door, the hat in both hands, the red eyes she had tried to explain as the wind. She thought about all of it, the long drives and the waiting and the letters and the plans and the children and the losses and the full, continuous, real life of it. John looked up from the book and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. I was just looking." He held her gaze for a moment, reading her the way he had been reading her for 22 years. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am so thoroughly all right," she said, and meant it in every direction it could possibly be meant. He looked at her with that full, quiet attention. Then he put the book down, reached across the table, and covered her hand with his. "Good," he said. "Me too." Outside, the Panhandle wind moved steadily through the autumn grass, carrying the scent of the season, of the wide country that had been the setting of their whole life together. And the stars were coming out one by one in the enormous Texas sky, just as they always had, and just as they always would, indifferent and steady and beautiful above the land where Harriet Wells had arrived at 21 looking for something real, and where John Yates had been building something real since 19, and where they had found each other and made all of it together into a life that was full and certain and completely, entirely their own.